All right, so we've been talking about mechanisms that can maintain species diversity, in particular mechanisms of coexistence. And we've sort of, in the last two videos, we went through a series of density-dependent ones, mechanisms that depend on the density of individuals in a population. There are a number that are density-independent. In many ways, island biogeography is density-independent. The colonization rate doesn't really depend on density. However, the extinction rate does, which is why I put it up here. And I want to talk about two density-independent mechanisms for this freshman class. This isn't an exhaustive list of all of them, right? So one of them is disturbance, and disturbance is just what ecologists call a density-independent factor that damages ecosystems and kills individuals. You know, you can think of lots of these: fire, storms, volcanoes, earthquakes, people, even animals in some cases can cause disturbance. You know, like bison in the prairies, they'll often make these dust baths and they basically kill all the plants while they're rolling around. You know, and that's a different mechanism than herbivory. And so that often gets categorized as disturbance. And so ecologists have often asked, well, what is the relationship between disturbance and species diversity? And the idea has become known as the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So again, you imagine you've got a series of premises. So we've got the disturbance rate and the number of species. The argument suggests that if we have really high disturbance rates, so we have volcanoes erupting every 20 minutes in some ecosystem, there's obviously not going to be very many species if there's volcanoes erupting every 20 minutes. It's just going to be a hellscape of fire and brimstone. Okay, cool. And now imagine no disturbance at all. Well, there you're going to have forces like competitive exclusion, and all the density-dependent processes we've talked about might reduce species or might cause certain species to go extinct. This is sort of drawn as if there would be zero, but you imagine it might intercept up here. So you can imagine that if these two premises are true, it stands to reason that there is some intermediate level of disturbance, right? Something between no disturbance and volcanoes erupting every 20 minutes, where you actually might get higher diversity because you have more species existing in the ecosystem than you might get in the absence of disturbance, if that makes sense. That's really all there is to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This is one of those things where it's a little bit vague, and so it can be hard to know what is meant by disturbance rate. And some people have argued that this isn't actually a useful idea in ecology, but it's old enough and it has a name, so we're going to learn it in this class. The next one I want you to think about is called the storage effect, right? So you could imagine that from the chapter I had you read this week that, you know, no species has adaptations that let them tolerate everything in the world, right? You very easily get a species that can tolerate Arctic freezing and tundra drought and live at the bottom of the ocean. It's just not possible. But you can get environments that are variable in time. You know, even if you're adapted to the Arctic, you can get warm winters and cold winters depending on the season. So if you, again, just think of the premises in this logic, another way for species to coexist would be if they have unique responses to the environments and a way of buffering the effects of bad years. So this is often thought of as a seed bank, right? Plants often have these seed banks that allow them to buffer the effects of bad years. So imagine plants of species 1 can't survive a really bad cold winter, the adults, while species 2 might be able to tolerate a really bad winter. As long as species 1 has a seed bank that can survive the winter, then it's not going to go extinct, even while all of the adult individuals might die, right? If seeds of species 1 can survive, then this might buffer species 1 against bad winter and let them increase in population size in good years and not go extinct, even if they might otherwise do so. So those are the mechanisms of coexistence I want you to know for this class. A bunch of them are density dependent and some of them are density independent, and maybe island biogeography is sort of 50-50 depending on who you ask. And so the last thing I want to talk about when we think about mechanisms of coexistence is this sort of new idea that people often call modern coexistence theory, although I don't know why it's modern. The idea is all of those mechanisms that I just talked to you about can be categorized in a couple of different ways. And this is an idea that Peter Chesson, a bit of a hero of mine actually, he's an incredible experimental and mathematical biologist. He categorized coexistence mechanisms into equalizing and stabilizing mechanisms. And so that's something I'd like you to know for this class as well. Right? So equalizing mechanisms, they reduce fitness differences between species. What this does is it makes species more equal in their population level processes, right? It makes them more equal in their births and deaths. Remember, fitness is survival and reproduction, right? And so what this does is if species have sort of equal levels of births and deaths, this can stabilize their population dynamics and thereby prevent extinction. If you could imagine that one species is much more variable in its births and deaths, it might spike up and spike down and then eventually go extinct. Right? So what you need for coexistence, right, at the carrying capacity, we need these species to actually have equal fitness. The fact that these have unequal fitness is part of what's driving them extinct, right? At the carrying capacity, both species have a 0 per capita population growth rate. The births and deaths are balancing. And so what you need then is for species to coexist, you need equalizing mechanisms to cause them to both be stable at positive carrying capacity sizes. Stabilizing mechanisms promote coexistence through the mechanism we've already talked about. They make intra-specific competition more intense than inter-specific competition. And that should be obvious. So if the species do better in monoculture than in mixture, they should be able to coexist. And we can see with Gauss's paramecium data, that's not true in this case. And that's what's potentially driving the species extinct. So that's equalizing and stabilizing mechanisms. And so this kind of ends the ecological mechanisms that create and maintain diversity. And in the next video, I want to talk about how evolution can potentially generate and maintain diversity. Because ecological processes are not the only ones that can create and maintain diversity.